Does Ireland have a king? Well, Dagty Evogus Fáilte. Hi, hello, and welcome. It's Jon O'Sullivan from the Irish Pagan School. And that is a question quite easily answered. No, ni answer, not hard to say. We do not have a king. But that doesn't mean we didn't have kings. And I'm not referring to the colonizing powers that took over Ireland and the, foreign enforcement of monarchy that was placed upon the island. I'm talking about older kings. I'm talking about going back to the structure of tribal Ireland as we know it existed from the early turn of the, I suppose, Common Era, the earliest records of our Common Era. So when we look at Ireland's past and the lore of Ireland's past as documented by the medieval manuscripts that we have, like the Great Book of Lecan, the Book of Kells, the Book of Fermoy, all of these amazing manuscripts, the way academics have broken it down is that it's broken into four different segments. So we have the mythological section, then we have the Ulster cycle, the Fenian cycle, or the Oceanic cycle, but then we move into the final cycle, which is known as the cycle of kings. And this is where things move much more away from the mythology of Ireland and into the history of Ireland, because the records within the cycles of kings are documented evidence that point to specific people which we can show in history lived on the island, and in some cases where they're buried. So the cycle of kings is less narrative flowing stories from the past and more glossaries, lists, annals, and records of who sat where in kingship during what time frame, but also fascinatingly, some comments about who and how the type of king that they were. And this gives us a really great insight into the structure of ancient Ireland society, tribal society, the structure of what's known as Tua or tribe, but then also the importance of certain aspects to becoming a king, because not everyone could become a king. But also, just because you're the firstborn child of someone who was a king doesn't guarantee that you're going to become the king either. And this is one thing that is fascinating about kingship in Ireland. So as we go back into it and as we look at the information, at one point there were 108 different recognized tribal power structures on the island, known as Tua or tribes. Each of them owed allegiance or fealty in this kind of feudal structure to an overarching family or clan. And this is where we get the O'Gonacht, the O'Briens, the famous O'Brien. We get the northern and the southern Neil clans. So there was a lot of different clan names, and they held powerful dominance within their tribal territory. But it wasn't just their own family, because a Tua wasn't just one, it was multiple families. It was anywhere from 18 to like 20 different families that could live within a territory of anything up to about 25 kilometers, as according to the records that we have. But even there, those territories would still be bound by certain provincial structures and allegiances. And so there were different categories of Tua. So there was ruling Tuas, but then there was also another like kind of subcategory of a dominated Tua. So the Tua that you would take over, the tribe you would conquer, they wouldn't have a king or a chieftain themselves, but they would owe fealty and allegiance to the provincial king or lord who had taken over their territories. Which is where we get all the stories about raiding, conflict, and battles. And it wasn't just a case of we're going to have a scrap for the scraps, like for resources, or we're going to scrap because we hate people. There were certain elements of challenge to be able to justify your right to rule as a chieftain or as a king. And part of that was to show what kind of ruler you were. And sometimes that ruler is about someone who looks internally to their lands, looks after their people, takes care of things. But then there's also a separate recognition known as a Torivri, um, or a bull king, essentially. And this was a king who was defined by the fact that they invaded everyone else's territory around them and brought the battle to other people. So there are multiple different recognitions of the type of king. So just because you are a king or a chieftain doesn't mean that you are defined to one particular role. But in saying that, there were specific obligations and onuses that fell on someone as the king. The king was responsible for Collecting money, yes, absolutely. And the way they would do that would by be traveling around their territory, traveling around and visiting within their tua. And they would have to be accompanied by certain recognized people. They couldn't travel on their own. They weren't allowed to travel on their own. And their job was to make sure not just traveling around, but also that the roads were fit to travel. So the king's responsibility within their territorial lands was to make sure that the roads were maintained. So it wasn't just a case of, oh, I'm going to take money for my own wealth and my own aggrandizement. It was, I'm going to collect pretty much taxes from those who owe me fealty to take care of the roads and make sure that our territory is maintained. One of the other important roles of a king is declaring an Éineach. An Éineach is the modern word for a fair or a gathering, but it was a specific structured fair or gathering declared by a king in order to have intertribal conversations. So an Aenach, there was an obligation on a king who was summoned to an Aenach that they have to turn up at the Aenach. And then when they arrive at the Aenach, only certain people who fall within that surnimid, this top tier or top caste, could be recognized to speak at the Aenach. And then any agreements that were held or came to those intertribal kind of conversations were carried away and then acted on from there. So you'd have to be a king to be able to call an Aenach. But as I mentioned, it wasn't just a case of the firstborn child becomes the king. Even now, there's a word in Irish known as Taoiseach, and the Taoiseach in our political structure is someone who kind of represents the power structures in a particular way. I'm not going to go into the political circumstances, but that word actually goes right the way back to ancient tribal society, where it's the heir apparent. It's the person who's going to take over should the king or chieftain die or like no longer be fit for duty because you don't have to actually die to lose your seat. You could be found inhospitable, you could be found unworthy, you could be found incapable, and the legal structures would then depose you an individual. So there's a lot of complexity, and this is why I absolutely loved this area of exploration when I was creating the class that I teach at the Irish Pagan School about this. But just because someone's a Taoiseach, just because they're the heir apparent, doesn't guarantee that they're going to become the king. Because when there is a succession question, anyone who's was in, I think it's four generations, anyone whose great great grandfather sat in a seat of kingship could put themselves forward to be judged fit or worthy for kingship. And then at that point, the other ruling nobles, the noble caste within the tribe would then vote to choose. They would then decide where they support, who they support, put forward the right candidates, and then it would come down to deciding how that tribe is going to go forward with whomever takes the seat. And we have records that sometimes the tribe can't come to an agreement about who's going to take over. And instead of it turning into a civil war, a murder fest, or anything like that at all, the tribe could be split. And so the territory would then be sectioned and split. They would then hold some allegiance and agreements within that structure of splitting because they're still family, they're still a connected unit. And that's where we get these substructures of Tuas who have allegiances to older family names. And then we get the northern and the southern Enil, famously. There was, though, an overruling king at some times in our history. There was no one true high king, one true high king bloodline. That's kind of bullshit. Um, but at the time of the turn of the common era, like when we go from the BCE time frames to like year one and onwards into common era, we have hundreds of years of records of tribal kings, Tua kings, but then also provincial kings. And so provinces would group together and decide who's going to speak for the province, if especially in cases of interprovincial conflict. But at times there were some individuals who generated enough power, collected enough hostages, raided or combated enough in order to secure a broader collection of allegiances. And that could have been by buying it or trading in wealth or like intermingling of families. Or actually it could have been straight up conquest and dominance. And so they would then declare themselves Ord Ri or a high or great king. But even then, there are very few who could claim to be an Ard Rí without being known as a king in opposition, so that there were some individuals in the island which refused to acknowledge that kingship or that right to rule. One of the most famous characters from our history and somewhat mythology is a guy called Brian Boru, who is said to be the last Ard Rí, in that we know that he conquered. He actually conquered and dominated over his lifetime much of the island, in almost completely the island. But even then, there were some people who declared opposition against him. But he was the one of the last. I think he actually was the last who could claim to have subjugated everywhere, like the Ullad in the northern tribe in the northern part of the Ireland. Actually, the Ullad, where Ulster gets its name from the tribe of the Ullad, they were the last ones, and he did actually, force them to essentially bend the knee, which allowed him to be declare himself a king of Ireland, no longer in opposition. Uh, but it didn't last very long. Like soon after, the Viking battles in Clontarf happened, and Brian Boru was wounded. But the worst, most crippling part of that was his eldest son, who was his Taoiseach, who he had prepared to become his like next. He was slain in the battle, and the other son of Brian Boru wasn't exactly fit to step into that role. So even though we look at Brian Boru and the history of Ireland as this great and powerful king, and he did all of these amazing things, it didn't last outside of his lifetime really, and it fell apart into like returned tribal narratives from there. So I really enjoyed exploring the kingship of Ireland and the history and the structure of Tua, the structure of tribal lands, because it wasn't just, yeah, everyone just lived there and that's what it is. There was clear caste system, and there were people within different structures of society who fulfilled different roles. As I said, a king wasn't allowed to travel without an entourage, really, and that entourage was specifically defined, and the territory of a Tua was specifically defined. So, if you would like to know more, if you would like to deep dive into the history and a little bit of mythology, I will say there are mythological kings as well that we touch on and talk about in Ireland. You can take the class. It's called Kings in Ireland. It is over at the Irish Pagan School. I'll pop a link down in below. But to go back to the top end, does Ireland have a king? And the answer, no. Not hard to say. We don't have a king. And the Lord of the Rings nerd in me was like, Ireland has no king. Ireland needs no king. A la Gondor. So yeah, thank you very much for stopping by. I hope this has been interesting for you, because it does give us another insight into what pre-colonized Ireland was like, and allows us to maybe ponder what would it have been like, or how it would have happened, or how things would have gone if it wasn't for the colonization and conflicts that followed. So anyway, thank you very much. Look after yourself, and until next time, Slán. Goodbye.